and welcome to our next Let's Talk About series. I'm Dave Longman, pastor at Simply Church, and we've been doing this series of talks looking at different topics, subjects that people are most interested in or where we've had most questions from. And this series is really looking at trying to answer them from a biblical point of view. And today I'm looking at let's talk about man or monkey. So this really is about creation and evolution. And there's always lots of questions, and particularly Christians have different views on this. Although I think the Bible has some clarity that it wants to speak into. There are different views. Some of these views align with some of the things that the world thinks about, and some of these views don't. So we're going to go through it. We're going to particularly look at the scriptures and discover what it has to say about this topic, creation, evolution. Now, first of all, the Bible isn't primarily a scientific textbook. It's not a scientific textbook at all, although it does speak into some of these aspects. And so that we can look at the Bible, we can understand aspects of the Bible, and we can then line it up to or measure it up with science. And what I want to say is, as Christians, we're not meant to just throw away science and say it's unimportant or doesn't exist. And in the same way, we're not meant to just discard the Bible as something that's archaic and doesn't have anything to say, but we want to somehow bring the two together. And that's what we're going to hopefully do today as we look at some of the scriptures, look at some of these areas of what creation and evolution is all about. So I'm just going to start with just reading a short bit from Genesis chapter 1. And that really outlines or begins to speak to us about the start of things. And it says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the Hebrew is bara reshet Elohim, this idea that God created out of nothing. And he uses the word, Moses, the writer of Genesis, uses the word reshit, which is a Hebrew word that means to create out of nothing. And there's another word, Asa, which comes later on in Genesis, which means to create out of something. So when God creates Adam out of the ground, the word is Asa because he creates it from something. But here it's Reshit, because it means created out of nothing. So right from the very beginning, the Bible wants to affirm to us that God created the heavens and the earth. And we think of the heavens, we're not just talking about heaven where God exists, but we're talking about the universe. God created the universe and the earth from nothing. And the word that we use for that is ex nihilo, from nothing. And straight from the outset, we know that there was God. He's eternally existed, but the earth didn't. And God creates this and brings something into being for us to then live upon. And as we read later on in the passage, that he actually gives the mandate to Adam and Eve to then to fill the earth, to subdue it, to be this, eventually that God's people will be this blessing upon the earth. Now there's some different views that people have over creation as Christians, and I just very quickly whiz through some of them, or the main ones. The first one is historic creationism, and that is that the earth is very old. It's older than human life. The earth was created at some point in the past, and then over 6 days, God then kind of forms it and fills it. And so this is historic creationism, that the earth was created in the past. So Augustine had some thoughts around this. And then the 6 days are literal, and God forms and fills it. Then there is young earth creationism, which is that the earth is relatively young. Humanity is relatively young. A figure that's often put is around 6,000 years that the earth was created, and that what we see in Genesis, that those 6 literal days, or the 7th God rested, but the 6 literal days was that the earth was created, formed, and filled over those days. So the earth still remains young. Gap theory kind of can seem similar to the first one, but it's slightly different. And this is that the earth was created sometime again in the past, some distant past, but something happened between verse maybe 1 and 2, and some calamity happened, something happened to the earth. There's this gap between those verses. So you see that God in the beginning created the heavens and the earth, and it says the earth was without form and void. So it's as if there's this kind of devastated earth in existence. So there's a gap between the two. Some people attribute it to the fall of Satan and maybe some devastation that came out of that. But that's the idea. So the earth is old. It's still literal 6 days. So God then forms and feels, or recreates forms and feels after that gap. But that's to try and explain an old earth and a young humanity. Then there's the literary framework view, which is that the earth is very old, humanity is young, and this is kind of a poetic narrative. It's not to be taken literally. We're meant to look at it poetically. It's just given us an idea that God is this creator and a former and a filler, and he loves his creation. He sees that it's good, and so it's a literary framework. We're not to take it as literal. We're not to take it as 24-hour periods. These aren't necessarily literal days. People might want to quote 2 Peter to say like that, days like 1,000 years. That is out of context, by the way. That's when Peter's talking about the coming of Jesus, and that it's, it seems like it's delayed, but it's coming. It's going to be coming, and for him, a day is like 1,000 years. Just trying to give us this concept of a time and space of God moving and coming again. It's got nothing to do with saying, well, actually a day we need to read as 1,000 years. So, but there we go. That's where it'd be used, and so they're not literal. And then you've got the day age view, and the day age view is that the earth is old, humanity is young again, but we just don't take the days literally. So it's similar to the literary framework, but that's really, the literary framework is really making it all very poetic. Whereas this is saying, hey, it's not poetic. There's, we want to take it a bit more literally than that, but let's just not take the days literally. This could be big, vast periods of time. So once again, the 2 Peter thing, 1,000 years in a day, all that kind of stuff going on there. And then lastly, there's the theistic evolutionists, people that believe that God used evolution to form and create, or to create and form the world. So they potentially may have a Big Bang ideology, that God would have started some sort of Big Bang process, and then the whole theory of evolution God used to then create different species and form humanity. So they're the different views. I'll say right from the outset, I'm a young earth creationist. I believe that Genesis is literal, that it's 6 literal days, not just, and they are 24-hour periods. These aren't just periods of time. This isn't just poetic, that we can actually see that God is creating. I'm not saying he's putting all the detail in. I'm not saying everything's in there. And I'm not saying that it's not written in a poetic form. But to start with, there are literal poems. Just because it's a poem doesn't mean it's not literal. Just because it's written in a poetic form doesn't mean that it's not literal. And I think the rest of the Bible will back that up. But we'll get into that as we move forward. So 6 days, are they literal? Are they 24 hours? Not. Like I said, the poetic view would say no. These day age views would say no. But like I said, just because it's poetic doesn't make it literal. So I don't think you can use that as an argument to say it's poetic, so it's not literal, because we have literal poems. And then this idea for day is the Hebrew word yom. And this is where it definitely gets a bit more tricky. So yom can mean a literal day, like a 24-hour day, but it also can mean a period of time. It may not be 24 hours. It could be a longer period of time. And so it's one of those Hebrew words that the context really will define what it means. So does it mean a 24-hour, or does it mean a large period of time? And that's where it can come unstuck. But here's why I think it means literally 24 hours, because let me read a section for you. So in verse 3 it says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning the first day." And the word day there is Hebrew yom. And then what we see that after every act of forming or filling. So the next thing on the next section in verse 8, it again says, "And there was evening, and there was morning the second day." Now, if it just said, and God created these things, and that was the end of the day, there could be more, be a bit more ambiguous. But because of like I said, context will help us to discover what that Hebrew word is actually trying to say. The very fact that it puts evening and morning is that the writer is wanting to define for us that these are days, 24-hour periods. That's why they're put after every single section. So if you took that out, yeah, I could see it being more ambiguous, but even just having that in makes it clear. And then the whole kind of idea of the Sabbath, when we get to God rests on the seventh day, he calls it holy. And then if we look at something like Exodus 20, when we're looking at the Ten Commandments, and let me just read that out for us, where it talks about to keep that Sabbath day holy. Let me just read it very, very quickly. In verse 11 of chapter 20 of Exodus, it says, For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth. So again, you could say it's periods of time, but as I said, we've got evening and morning, and the sea. And he said, all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So that even the principle of our working week and of a Sabbath, which was obviously a Saturday and it's from evening to evening. So this is this idea of evening to morning. This whole idea of a Sabbath that Exodus is referring back to. So the problem is, if we don't make them literal days, is then we can say, well, our Sabbath could be any period of time, or our working week isn't 7 days, it could be any period of time. It begins to just throw out everything, and the whole way that the Bible is referring back to how we're meant to live and to work, and this pattern that God lays down. So God could have created in a second. He could have created in a millisecond. He could have created over huge periods of time. I believe he chose these 6 days of creation and 7 days of rest to lay down a pattern for us. And we see this a lot in the Bible, that God does things for our good. He doesn't have to necessarily do them these ways, but he chooses to. He chooses to do 6 days plus a rest to show us what life is meant to look like. We're meant to work 6 days rest. I can go into Sabbath and what Sabbath means now, that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And I don't want to get into that now because that'll take us off course. But at the moment, let's just take it as, this idea of 6 days and 1 day rest is this Sabbath rest. And God lays it down for us in Genesis in the way that he creates, so that we too can live like that. And I think the writer wants to make it clear to us these are literal days by saying evening and morning. And so for me, and the other ways that the Bible refers back into this, it proves to me that God is wanting us to believe these are 6 literal days. Now that means it still could fit the historic view or the gap theory, so the earth could still be older and humanity young, but I think there's reasons and scientific explanations why the earth can look older than it actually is. And it's not God trying to deceive us or cover our eyes. It's actually that God has to do it that way for the world to exist. And so let me just say this right now. So for the ecosystem to function, there has to be, and this is some of the issues with evolution, but we'll get onto that. So for the world to function, this ecosystem to function, it does need to be mature, fully running. So God does have to create an earth with age for it to be able to sustain and exist. It's not covering over the wall, but it's so it can exist. And so, even stars being, billions of light years away or whatever, and the time it would take for light, God can create with that time and that light already in place, because we need that light. We need the light, the sun and the moon and things like this. So I think there are good explanations to show us that an earth can look older than it actually is, not to try and deceive us, but because the world needs to. And then if we got into, and I might get into this a bit later, if we got into flood accounts and other stories in the Bible where these, global flood would lay down sediment layers much quicker and would create big chasms faster than normal, and again would show why our landscape is scarred and marred in the way that it is. So how old is the earth? People debate that. Young earth are going to say around 6,000 years. Old earth will, maybe fit even more with people who are more atheistic or Big Bang type theologies, millions, billions of years kind of ideas. I think the Bible, like I said, pushes towards a younger earth from all the things that I've just said, that God did create out of nothing in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. There's nothing in there to say there was a gap or something different happened, or that this was I guess apart from what God was already doing. What we're getting in the beginning few verses of Genesis, it's like a potter throwing down his clay or her clay onto a potter's wheel, and it's like God's thrown the earth, this formless void of earth, and he's sculpting it and molding it over 6 days. Big Bang evolution atheists or even theistic evolutionists that may hold that view, the issues with the Big Bang theory is, particularly if you're not a Christian, so if you're an atheist, is that the ultimate issue is that nothing created everything, because that's the reality of that view. And to be honest, let's just think about it for a moment. If we really believe that that nothing created everything, and I know people try and get clever of looking at, trying to study black holes and how they form, and does that give us clues, and things that are so small that we can't see. But the reality is, it's still saying that there has to be something. Has to be something for that Big Bang, that huge spreading of that fast accelerated spreading of the universe. That there had to be something. There had to be. And so theistic evolution can say it's God, but if you're an atheist, you can't say that, because the Big Bang would say, okay, maybe around 13.8 billion years ago, from something infinitesimally small, this incredibly hot, dense point within, there was no universe, but within, before time was even created, I guess, this Big Bang takes place, and then the universe rapidly expands and cools, and it creates space, time, matter, eventually forms stars. And that's obviously simplistic. You don't have time to go into all the details of it. But how can everything come from nothing? And this is the issue with it. And so it still doesn't explain it. So theistics have an answer, atheists don't. And then from that, we've got then evolution. So from this expanded universe where matter begins to be created, it tries to explain, okay, well, where does life come from? Where do we come from as human beings? Were we man or were we monkey? This is why I title it man or monkey. Did we come from some kind of primate being? So how did these things evolve from small single-celled organisms into complex organisms? And how did did mutations cause it? Natural selection? Is it a combination of all these different things? And so the theory of evolution is trying to come up with a way of looking at the complexity of our universe and of all the living organisms. So, well, if there is no God, then this must be how it happened. And what Christian evolutionists have then done, have gone, okay, well, it looks like that. The science looks good. So, okay, well, maybe that's how God did it. And so they put God into it. But ultimately, it came out from a godless viewpoint. And it's certainly not what our Bible tells us. And let me just say one thing on that for the moment is, the Bible tells us that when God created Adam and Eve, he created them, or created humanity, and we know Adam and Eve were the first, if we take it literally, but at least he created humans. It said that he created them in his image. And so the issue is, if we originally evolved from some kind of single-celled organism into a more complex primate kind of being, into now a human being, how and when did God create us in his image? What was the whole thing about the dust of the earth and breathing life into the nostrils of Adam and making him a life-giving spirit? That's what the Bible tells us in the beginning of Genesis, that God breathed into the nostrils of Adam and he became a life-giving spirit. If we are to believe what the Bible says, and it says we were made in his image and he breathed into Adam's nostrils and gave him life, how on earth does that fit any kind of evolutionary process? Now, that's not the only issue. Evolution itself stands huge amounts of problems. Even if you put the Bible to a side for a moment and you just looked at the science doesn't stack up. The science really doesn't stack up with evolution. So let's just look at some of these issues, some of the problems. So I've already mentioned it. Nothing made everything. So that's a biggie. Goes right back all the way to a guy called Paley. And so we've got to try and come up with something for that. And that still hasn't ever been rectified. Then we've got issues with how does something that's so chaotic like an expanding universe or evolution create something so ordered? How can something with such great design be created with no designer? How can impersonal matter create something with personality and emotion and feeling? Where do the, and I know there's theories about emotions, and there are theories about even morality and how those things come into being, but none of them really do justice. How can something that has no intelligence, has no personality, has no creativity, form into something that has those things? How does the unintelligent make that which is intelligent? And none of those things can actually be argued well. There's no reasons for them. I've never come across anything that explains those things in a satisfactory way. We know that there's the kind of the complexity, the fine tuning of the universe, all of those sorts of things. These arguments that I've made. I've often said you don't throw a load of Lego bricks on the ground and they randomly form into a car. Somebody has to think and construct. You don't look at that. My kid comes home and has built a model car. I don't go, well, how did that come into being? Was that just through evolution? Was it random chance? Well, something with thought and creativity put that together. And it's not hard to look around and think, that's what's happened here. There's no way that the complexity that we have can come from random chance, because that's ultimately what evolution is stating, and even the Big Bang Theory. Here's some other things. Evolution, as we know, the reason why the date of evolution has got longer and longer and longer, millions now into 13.8, Big Bang 13.8 billion years. The reason why evolution has got longer and longer and longer is because for the theory to work, there needs to be a significant amount of time for that process to occur. It needs to be a very, very long time. And so what we're talking about is that these simple-celled organisms are evolving into more complex organisms. And as they're developing different complex parts, this requires long periods of time. But the issue is there is no fossil record that backs that. You would need thousands, if not millions, of intermediate species that would demonstrate that evolution has taken place. There's been a few species that have found that people have said these must be, intermediate species, but when you look at them, they never are really. They are either just, different from a bear or horse that's just smaller than what we see today. We don't see the same intermediate species, and many of them have often been doctored or forged. Piltdown Man, this guy that was meant to be half human, half ape, and it was found that someone had attached some orangutan bones to a human skull. These things keep happening time and time again. But if we look at the study of evolution, Homo habilis and Homo afarensis, and then Homo erectus into Homo sapiens, you look at the fossils of these different creatures, and they're not human. There's a real change when sapiens take place, and there's nothing that shows us anything in between. So I want to put out there, we should be seeing far more fossils of multitudes of intermediate species if evolution was credible, because of the amount of time that it takes for those things to happen. No one's ever been able to replicate evolution in any way, shape or form. Some guys did some experiments on trying to create different building blocks of DNA and nucleotides and all kinds of proteins and stuff, and have just found that they've never been able to successfully recreate even some of these simplest building blocks in the way that they would need to actually sustain life. So there's so many problems. It creates confusion, I think, because although when we watch David Attenborough on the TV and it sounds so credible, look how these species evolved, and we kind of just take it, if we actually stopped and engaged our brains for a moment without even having to have a huge amount of scientific background. And I have a degree in zoology, I've studied this, but even if you didn't have those things, you would still find that there is big issues, big problems, challenges with that theory, that it isn't actually the best science around. There was a guy called George Ward, 1967, and he won a Nobel Prize. Now, this is an atheist, doesn't believe in God. He's not a believer, he's not a Christian. He's just somebody that has studied, has some background in this field. And he makes this, I'm just going to read his quote. It says, "When it comes to the origin of life, we have only two possibilities as how to life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation was scientifically disproved 100 years ago by Louis Pasteur, Spallanzani, Reddy and others. That leads us scientifically to only one possible conclusion, that life arose as a supernatural creative act of God." This is an atheist scientist that says the science doesn't stack up. And he keeps going. He says, "I will not accept that philosophically." You notice he said philosophically, he didn't say scientifically. He says, "I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation arising to evolution." Here's a guy that says science doesn't stack up, but I don't believe in God, so I'm just going to have to go with it. And that's crazy. That sums up. The Bible affirms that God creates. He creates over 6 days, rests on the seventh. Humans are unique, made in the image of God. There's no evolution that's taking place in whatsoever, and the science backs that up. Science, time and time again, shows that evolution does not work. There still has been no proof for it. Yet the Bible makes it clear that's because God created it, an intelligent, creative being with personality, made all that we see out of his love for us, and created this world in which we can live on. So what does this reveal to us about God? So many aspects to us of who God is and what he's done. It shows us that God is eternal. God has always existed. He's always been there. And in fact, if you're an evolutionist, you believe the world's eternal, that there has to have been something to create what there is. So something of the earth was eternal. And we believe that something is God. He is the ultimate being and power of the universe. That God is living and loving and good, because all that he created was good. It was us through sin that marred and fractured and devastated our world. God is intimate in his world, but he's also independent of it. He didn't require it. He created it. Created as part of his expression of love and creativity. And so he's separate from it, but he's very much part of it. He's immanent and involved in his creation. God has personality. He's got personhood. There are personal qualities of God, and we see that in who we are because we're made in his image. God has beauty and power and creativity, as we see. He's got order, fine-tuning and design. God is good. Everything he made was good. So he didn't make it bad. He didn't create sin, and that's a whole different debate. But sin came in through our own rebellion, through choice that God gave us. And when there's choice, you can choose to fall away from what is good, and that's what happened. He speaks, he walks, he loves, he continues to care for, he's gracious, he blesses. When we look at just the beginning of Genesis, it tells us something about a God who is amazing. And I know so many people look at the world and say, but look, all the bad stuff. And if he was good, why is that? And that's a whole new topic that we'll be talking on, how good God is in suffering, and how do we reconcile that? But when we look at that, that wasn't his design. That was our design. His design was a good earth for good people to live on and to enjoy. And so I want to encourage us not to be afraid of evolution, not to be afraid of science. I want us to look at it, explore it, but look behind the scenes a bit. Don't just believe everything you read. Don't believe just the popular stuff that is banded around. You'll find there's lots of other truths behind it, lots of fakes and forgeries that have happened. There's even textbooks. Ernst Haeckel's, he designed these embryos and made them all look the same. They're in kids' textbooks. I think they're in schools today, and it was shown that he forged them. He adapted them. They weren't really accurate. People still pass it off saying, well, it doesn't really matter, but there's so much of that goes on because the science has fallen flat on its face. There isn't the evidence, there isn't the fossil record. Even when we look at, like I said, when we look at the world and we look at the age of it, floods, catastrophic events easily can form these layers and sediments and chasms, all of those kinds of stuff. So I want us to be able to engage with this stuff. I want us to be able to be intellectual with it, not just to pass it off, but realize actually good science backs up what the Bible says. Because when you start to look at science, you start to say, okay, wow, yeah, we are complex. Well, that's because God is complex. We are creative because God is creative. And actually, yeah, God, this earth and everything in it, God created in a way that is phenomenal and perfect and great. Yes, it's marred and fractured by sin, but that wasn't the way it was meant to be. And so the story is that Jesus wants to come back and restore that, and Jesus did, and he came to restore it through defeating sin upon a cross and coming to bring new life to people, so that one day when he comes again, the earth can be restored and made new again, just like it was in Eden before sin came. And that's the great message, that if we can trust the God who is good and created all that is good, and even though it's broken by sin, he's coming again and he's going to restore and make it all good again. And that's what I really want to encourage you with as I close. And I'll read this from the book of Revelation, and chapter 4, verse 11. It's the very last book of the Bible. It says, "Worthy are you, O Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you create all things, and by your will they existed and were created." Let me read that again. "Worthy are you, O Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." That's the affirmation of the Bible. And we worship that God as Christians. We believe in that God as Christians. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully there's some stuff for you to start to look at. I don't want to make it much longer. There's so much more detail I could go into. But I hope it just highlights some parts, pulls some of the ideas of evolution apart a bit, helps us to be confident that we can trust the Bible and what God has to say, and still have a scientific mindset to know that God is good, and all that we see around us, the beauty of his creation, he created, and he continues to sustain it, and he will make it new again one day. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for being part of this. If you have questions, speak to you can reach out to us or speak to people around you. And look forward to coming back with the next session, which will actually be looking at dragons and dinosaurs. So we'll kind of follow on from this in some way.
What I have, see the twisted trophies of a dead man.